All right, everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to get into the input component, specifically for our abilities. Um, I know people like to have abilities on, there's an E ability or a one, two, three, four ability. So we're going to take a page out of the Lyra project, and they did a very cool using gas and the enhanced input component. They did a very cool thing that we can do that works well with gas in order to label our inputs more dynamically and be able to swap abilities and stuff and everything. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to come into our C++ classes into public. We're going to create a new C++ class, and it's going to be an enhanced input components, and we'll call it RPG systems in components, and we'll put this inside input, and then we're going to come back and make another class, and this will just be a data asset and this will be RPG input config. I'll put that in input as well. Inside the input config is pretty straightforward for now. We just need to make a struct. We need to declare a struct, and we'll call it frpg input action. And this is going to take two things. The first one is a t-object pointer of a u input action, which we'll do a forward declaration for, called input action. And we will give this a u property, edit defaults only. We should initialize, so that'll be set equal to no pointer. And then we'll do an f gameplay tag, which meets include, and this will be the input tag, and we'll set that equal to f gameplay tag with a default constructor. Why do I keep hitting that key? And we'll give it a u property with edit defaults only. And down in the actual asset itself, I'm just going to make a public section with a t array of f RPG input actions, and this will be RPG input actions. Give it a u property, and we'll say edit defaults only. And now we have an input config data asset that's just going to have an array of these structs where it's got one input action and one gameplay tag. So now that we have that data asset, I just need to make a public section inside the enhanced input component, and we're going to, this is pretty much what Lyra does. Essentially, the function bind action is a Variadric function, right? Back in the regular enhanced input component itself, the function, if I find bind action. Oh, there's a bunch of them here. Right here, bind action. Do you see they have this? This is normally how you bind an action, right? You put the input action in the trigger event, and you say this, and then you're saying this is the callback function, right? But the thing is they also have this var types vars here, right? So the thing is you're allowed to override this function, and you're allowed to create whatever variables you want to and add it on to the end of the function, completely up to you, right? So what we're going to do is take that input, and we're going to say we're going to make a template function. We're going to say templates class user class, and then we're going to say type name, and this will be pressed func type, and then we'll say type name, and it'll be released func type, and we're going to make one function, and it's going to be called bind ability actions, and it's going to start by taking a urpg input config pointer called input config. It will take the user class pointer, which is object, and then it will take, the pressed func type. This will be the pressed function. and then the released func type, this will be the released function. Now if I have this, I can generate a definition, which puts it right down below. That's fine. There's only one function, so I really don't even need this CPP file. We'll just do it right here. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to check the input config. If the input config is good, then we're going to say for, and we're going to do const frpg input action, which we can do. Hopefully I can do a for declaration. No, I can't do that. I need the include. I can't because I'm trying to use it. Oh, excuse me. Include. So we're going to say for f input action, that we'll just call action, and we're going to find that inside the input config. We have the RPG input actions. So we can say that if the action dot input action dot is valid. Oh, I put it on the wrong way. I think it needs to be here. Is valid, and then input action, and the other one's a gameplay tag, so I should be able just to say action dot input tag dot is valid. And if I do that, then I say, well, if the pressed func is valid, but I just have to say if pressed func, then you can call bind action. And the bind action needs the input action to start, which is there. And then it needs the E trigger event, which is the E trigger event started. And then it needs the object, which will be the object. And then we're going to pass in the pressed function, right? But then we're also going to pass through the action.input tag. And then we're going to repeat right here for the released func. We're going to say if released func bind action. And we're going to say action.input action. E trigger event completed, pass through the object, and then the release func, and then the action.input tag. Okay, so now I have this input component handled. Well, that's all we're going to want to do. We're going to come back into the player controller. We'll open the header of the player controller. And in the private section, I have all this inventory, but we'll start up here. We're going to make a T object pointer to the URPG input config, and we will forward declare that, and we'll call this RPG input config. And we'll give it to U property, make it edit defaults only, and put the category as custom values input. And then with that back in the public, we're going to come, these are the overrides, but I just need another override. So we're going to do a virtual override of this engine function. It's virtual void setup input component override. And then if we make a function and generate here, we're going to call super. And then we can start by saying if you RPG systems input component, that's there twice, I don't know why. If you RPG systems component pointer RPG input comp, and we're going to set that equal to a cast of a URPG systems input component, and we're casting that onto, you can literally just type input component, because right here in this function it's valid. So if it is valid and we can make that cast, then what we can say is the RPG input comp bindability actions, right? And then we just put the input config as a variable, so we'll pass it in there. The object is this, and then now we need the pressed func and the released func. Well, like any other callback that you're binding, the pressed func and the released func need to be matching signature. So we can make a protected section here where I could say void, and I can say ability input pressed, and we're passing through now an F gameplay tag that we can call Yes, include. Excuse my writer today. Include. Include. Thank you. F gameplay tag is this input tag. And then we can also say void ability input released, and we're passing through an F gameplay tag called input tag. And now I generate these definitions, and now I have a pressed function, which is and the address, and we could just say this class and then fully qualify ability input pressed, and then we could do the same thing, and this class ability input released. So now all of our abilities, the input actions, we can label them with a tag, and then every time one of those input actions comes through, it'll send through which input tag that you, or which gameplay tag that you labeled for that. So it's really useful when we come through and we say, okay, in the ability system, oh, I'm in the private, let's go in the public. In the ability system component, we're going to have two more functions. We're going to say void um, uh, ability input pressed, and it's still going. This one can take a const F gameplay tag reference called input tag. I could do const reference here, so we'll do it here. And we'll do input released as well. And we'll say const F gameplay tag reference input tag. And we can make these here. So I'm going to make an ability input pressed and an ability input released inside the RPG ability system component, and I'm going to want to call it from inside the player controller. So unfortunately, that means if we're thinking about this, I need a pointer to the ability system component on the player controller, don't I? Inventory component, inventory widget. Yeah, actually. Oh, I've just had this get ability system component hanging out here on the player controller for a while and inherited from the ability system interface that apparently I completely overlooked this entire time, and I didn't even have a definition for it. My apologies. But yeah, I'm going to want a T object pointer of a URPG system ability system component, and we can call RPG ability system comp. And we just need to wrap it with a U property. And in the begin play, which I don't have a begin play, so it looks like I'm going to need a virtual void begin play in the protected section. And that I can just simply say that the, I can say if a RPG player state pointer RPG player state equals get player state, and inside the template a RPG player state, I can then just say that the RPG ability system comp is equal to the RPG player state. Remember, we could just call get RPG ability system component, and looks like that could be a const pointer, so we'll make it const. So I should have that cached in the beginning, which means I can say on the ability input pressed, I can say if is valid RPG ability system component, which it's not recognizing as a U object, so I need to include ability system slash RPG ability system component dot h, which now it's the object. So I can say RPG ability system component ability input press passing through the input tag. And then we can do the same exact thing here and say if is valid RPG ability system comp. We can say RPG ability system comp and then say ability input released passing through the input tag. Okay, and then so now we have the ability inside the player controller to call the ability input pressed and ability input released off the ability system component. So if I come back in here and I say in the CPP file, okay, on my player controller, I pushed an input, the input action triggered, and it sent through this input tag. And so now I have this input tag. Well, we're going to loop through, um, we're going to loop through all of your activatable abilities, all the abilities that you can activate, and we're going to find which one has the input tag that matches our input that we're labeling it and try to activate that one. Uh, and we're going to say mark that button press. So whenever you roll through all of your activatable abilities, there's something called a scoped ability list lock. And you can do this one of two ways. You can just formally declare this by saying like an F scoped ability list lock, and then you can say like active scope lock, but you initialize this with a dereference this, right? So you can get an ability list lock this that'll make sure that it stays true to what you've got to activate right now. But if you don't want to do that, you can also, there's a macro, you could just say ability list scope lock like that, and it types all of that out for you. So before we do that though, we're going to ask ourselves if that input tag, if not, input tag dot is valid, we're just going to early return. So we'll make sure that the input tag is there. So now that I have an ability list scope lock, what I can do is say for const f gameplay ability spec reference, and I call this spec, and we're going to loop through get activatable abilities. And we're going to ask ourselves, if on that spec inside there, there's something called dynamic ability tags, and we're going to ask it if it has tag exact input tag. So if in this dynamic abilities tag container inside this ability spec, if there's that input tag, we're going to ask ourselves if not spec dot is active, we are going to try activate ability, passing in the spec dot handle. And then we're going to say else, we're going to call this function invoke replicated event. And the ability generic replicated event is going to be input pressed. We need to give it the spec handle, which is spec.handle. And then we need the activation, the ability original prediction key, the activation prediction key. And that's found inside the spec. We're going to look in the activation info, and then we call get activation prediction key. This invoke replicated event has, well, nothing really to do with multiplayer. You need it in single player, but there's a couple nodes inside the abilities themselves that we'll get to that are asynchronous nodes that wait for input pressed and input released signals from the game. But those nodes only work if you call this invoke replicated event, right? You can put them in your graph, but they won't work unless you call this specific function in C++. So we'll do that. So if the ability isn't going, we'll try to activate it. If the ability is already active, then instead of activating the ability again, it's just going to call this replicated event that says, hey, our input was pressed, by the way. And we'll see how that comes into use. It comes into pretty good use. But now that we're doing release, it's going to be the same similar concept. We're just going to say if not input tag dot is valid, we can early return, and then we're going to do the ability list scope lock, and then we're going to say for const f gameplay ability spec reference spec looping through get activatable abilities, and then we're going to say if spec dot dynamic ability tag dot has tag exact input tag. This one, we're not going to call end ability, right? We don't want to end ability when we release the tag. The only thing we really want to do is invoke invoke replicated event with the E ability generic replicated event fully qualified the input released, and still needs the same spec.handle and then spec.activation info.get activation prediction key. So now in your ability system component, well, from your player controller, we put the input configuration in there. We grab our player controller, we hit key number E, which passes tag through all the way through to the ability system component from the player controller. It lands up here, locks into scope what your abilities are, and then cycles through them and says, here you go. If you've got the input tag, activate. And if you're already active, then they push the button again. And the other idea that it's input released here. So that's how we're going to do some of these, that's how we're going to do our inputs for our abilities. The next part is going to be, we need to come back into our C++ classes in here, and we're going to make our custom gameplay ability class. Gameplay ability. And we could just say this is RPG gameplay ability, and this will go in the ability system / abilities. We can create this code now, and the only thing we need to do for now in our custom gameplay ability class is we make a public section, and in the public section it has an F gameplay tag that we will call input tag. And we give this a U property, and this is edit defaults only, category equals custom values input. The only thing we need to do that is that, because now that we've set this up, we're looking through all of these dynamic ability tags through all these specs, but we never actually give it to the dynamic ability tags. So what we're going to want to do is add character abilities. These are the active abilities, right? So now that we have the ability spec here, before we give the ability, let's break it for a second. We're going to say if, now we need a URPG gameplay ability, and we can call this RPG ability, and we're going to set that equal to the result of a cast of a URPG gameplay ability, and we're casting that onto the ability spec. Inside there is the ability spec.ability. So if I can do that, then what I can say is the ability spec has the dynamic ability tags, and then I can add the tag, which is the RPG ability. You have the input tag. And then at that point, we'll give the ability now. So now every ability that we grant is going to have an input tag labeled with it, and this whole stuff should float on through. In order to test where we're at so far, we're going to need to rebuild the project. So I'm just going to hit rebuild and see you in the loaded state. All right, so now that we're back in the editor, let's take care of the bookkeeping that needs to do. The first thing we need to do is come into edit, and in your project settings, we need to type in enhanced input. And the default input component class is no longer the enhanced input. It is now the RPG systems input components. And then now that that's changed in your project settings, you come back into your content, my third person. I have an input folder here, and what I'm going to do is create a miscellaneous data asset that should be off the RPG input config here, and I'll call this DA input config, and we've just got a whole bunch of input action that we're going to need a struct. I need an input action and an input tag. So in our actions, I've got, these are just the default ones, jump, look, and move. But if I come in here into input and I say IAE ability, and I duplicate this and I say IA Q ability, and then I duplicate this and I say IA left shift. You just say shift ability, right? So I can save all of those, and then what I need to do is I then take this and say the E ability. I don't have any tags, so we're going to have to add a new tag, and we say input.E ability. And we can add that there, and then we need to make Q ability, and then we need to make a shift ability. And so now I have those tags. Like I say, E ability has the tag of input E ability. And then another one, and this is Q ability, has input Q ability. And the shift ability has shift ability. So now I have my input config done. I can come back into the blueprints, into the where is player controller. And inside the player controller, I need to come to the class defaults and say custom values. And in the input, the config is here. So I put the config there. And then come into ability systems, attributes, make a new folder called abilities. And we're going to make a folder and call this E ability. And inside E ability, we're going to make a blueprint class, and this is going to be an RPG gameplay ability. And this is going to be prefixed with GA for all gameplay abilities, and this is E ability just for testing purposes. And the only thing we actually really need to do here is up in the class defaults, I have the custom values, the input tag. The input tag's here now, so I can say, well, this is the E ability. So just to show that all of that works off the tags, you could just print string here and say hello, or this is E ability activated. You say E ability activated, right? Well, kind of. What do we got to do to make sure that we can actually activate an ability when we push something and it says try to activate ability? You must grant an ability to the ability system component before it can activate, right? So let's make sure that in our ability system, let's see attributes in that. I have data, I have character class information. So it looks like now back in the character player default, the starting abilities. Now we need to say, okay, well, GAE ability is an available ability now when they start. So we should be able to just go in there, and then I have E. Oh, excuse me, no. The last thing I need to do, excuse me, is go back into the input. We need to go into the input mapping context. Just because we added it to the config doesn't mean we added it to the context. So we're going to add E ability, and that's going to be on key E. And then we're going to have Q ability, and that's going to be on Q. And then, oh, it's going to do this every time. Shift ability is going to be on left shift. Okay, so now it should be working. So I'm going to push play, and I'm going to come over here. I'm going to push E, and it says server E ability activated. And then I'm going to come on the client and push E, and nothing happens. And we'll figure out why. So here we are, and the ability works on server E ability activated, but you can only push it one time and it doesn't do anything else after that. And then on the client, I push E and nothing happens. Okay, so GAE ability. GAE ability. Let's open that. In any ability, what we're going to do is just put a wait delay here real quick, and I'll give it 1 second. If you want to be able to use the ability again, you have to call end ability, right? You have to call end ability. So now if I'm on the server and I push E, at least I can have server E ability, but I can't activate it more than once a second. But then I still have nothing on the clients. So the first thing I want to check is, well, ability input press, right? I push E. This is supposed to call the ability system component input press. So let's put here on pressed and released and see what happens. So I know on the server it's good. Oh, excuse me, I must have pushed that. I know on the server it's good, so let's come on the client and then push E, and it doesn't hit those breakpoints at all. Which means really the only reason it wouldn't hit the breakpoints is if this RPG ability system component isn't valid, right? So that means our getter here is not working on clients. So let's change our getter a little bit. Let's make a URPG ability system component pointer that says get RPG ability system components. And we can do this. We say if not is valid RPG ability system comp, and then we can do our getter. We can put our getter right there, and then we can return the RPG ability system comp. So what that'll do is just only the first time that it's not valid, it'll pull it from there. Anytime it's not valid, it'll try to pull it from there until it becomes valid, and then when it is valid there. So that means what we're going to do is we're going to say if is valid, and then we're going to say get RPG ability system component. Get RPG ability system component. So now it'll get, theoretically, the player will have given enough time to replicate the ability system component before they push an ability input, hopefully. All right, so now that we're back here, we can open this up, and then I have activate ability and then wait a second and it stops. So I still have it on the server, E ability activated, E ability activated. And then on the client side, here we go, on the clients, here we go. E ability activated, and then it also repeats it on the server as well. So client is activating it first, and then the server activates it second, because local prediction with server rollback is built into GAS. So your client will always activate it before the server does. But that's setting up our input, ready to get into abilities next. I'll catch you guys next time.